back all to the 11th out of our 12-week series here, the reNaturing Ourselves Soil and Nutrition Conference. I'm calling in from a library in Bogota, Colombia today. So in keeping with the theme of the global community, here we are showing up from South America. We'll be at the COP event in Brazil later this week, which is going to be very exciting. I'm really happy to have Nigel and Kym on today from Circle Ag and Tiverton. Do you guys want to turn your cameras and your voices back on? There you are. Brilliant.
Morning.
Right.
Morning.
Morning. What is it? 4 o'clock and 5 o'clock in the morning for you tomorrow? I think along those lines. Yes. Thank you. Thank you for joining us at this inopportune hour. I guess you're used to being present with people from other continents, but yeah, I first went to Australia in December of last year. It's been less than a year, but I've as I said to many people, there's so many brilliant people doing brilliant things in that country. They're completely oversampled for cutting edge work, and I think Kym's been on the tracking the farm soil health, microbiome, agronomy side for years, and really helping work with farmers of all scales and build their own ferments. And Nigel's been just doing powerful work with operating on scale, everything from carbon to reversing extinction of numerous species. It's I don't say we're saving the best for the last, but we definitely have a real exciting presentation today. So I'm going to let you guys run. There's way more things that you're in the middle of than we have time for in an hour. So I'll let you cover the things that you're prepared for, and then I'll jump back in with some Q&A for 30 minutes like we usually do, and then we'll open it up for Q&A for everyone else, all the attendees, for the last half hour. So I'll turn my camera off, and I'll let you guys go for it.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. And hello to everybody. We've had, as Dan said, we only met within the last 12 months, but we've had an enormous amount of interaction and thoroughly enjoyed the engagement. Dan's been back a couple of times to Australia, which has been fortunate for us. And most recently, we spent some time, I spent time with Dan on his tour for the treaty at the Farm by School at the Bellarine Peninsula, and it was just such a wonderful community project that which I will touch on today. Today I'm presenting with Kym, and we'll both introduce ourselves in a moment. I'd just firstly like to acknowledge the First Nations group of the place where I'm presenting here today, the Wadawurrung people, who we do a lot of work with, and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. It's been a great series so far. I think it's fantastic that you're doing this, Dan. It gives us all a chance to learn from each other and share knowledge. And it's the sharing piece that is going to advance all of the work that we're all focused on achieving for a sustainable future. Today, Kym and I are going to touch on Tiverton and the subsidiary groups and the partners that we work with, and as we refer to it, our Healthy Balance mission, in that we're looking really at the broader landscape from food, forestry, biodiversity, and each of the projects that we're involved have that mission. We're going to go through our results from the work that we're doing in soil enhancement and carbon sequestration, and talk a little bit about the future directions of Tiverton. I'll just introduce myself for a start, and then pass across to Kym. The photograph on the left, that's myself, my dad, and my daughter. We've been in farming for a long time, although my career did vary from farming. But I grew up on a small farm in Western Victoria. My dad was a soil conservationist. Australia formed the Soil Conservation Authority in the late 1960s. So he had a small farm and a second job of soil conservation. And Uh, that was our life as teenagers, looking at erosion and really interesting, no, looking at erosion and planting trees. Salinity was a big issue back then. And Kym and I were only just discussing this the other day, but it was interesting. We're out there planting trees. At the same time, we're looking across the paddocks at the super trucks that had arrived and started putting out superphosphates. So on one hand, we were doing good and didn't understand the soil degradation that was happening on the other part of the farm. My dad insisted that conservation was a pretty hard task, so he encouraged me to go into the property industry, and I ended up working through the property industry, funds management, and when I IPO'd a property trust quite a few years ago and ran that as a listed entity for some time, and had my wife and I bought a small farm on French Island. It's a farm. It's in Victoria, French Island, but it's you can only access it by boat, and there was no feral animals. And we started our first little conservation project there, and that led us to buying a much larger conservation project, which is today called Mount Rothwell, and has been operating, saving the threatened species and bringing some back from extinction, as Dan said, extinction in Victoria, that is. So that's taught us a lot more about soil from the perspective of what our fauna can deliver in Australia, and led me to buying a farm with Harry Youngman, who was one of the co-founders of the fund I'm going to talk about today. And we bought a farm called Tiverton, and it was a couple 2,500 acres of native grassland. And you can see from that photo the big wind towers behind it. It's subsequently built a large wind farm next to it. And on that farm, we introduced sheep, a sheep grazing regime to enhance the grasses and the soil carbon. And then we reintroduced the native mammals that used to exist 100, 200 years ago, which amazing soil engineers. And so we've got this cohabitation of sheep grazing in Australia and Southeast Australia where we are. There's an eastern barred bandicoot and an eastern quoll and some bettongs. These are all quite, these were almost extinct, these animals, and they've come back. And we've got this cohabitation piece happening where we're seeing proliferation of grasses and herbs and forbs and fungi that weren't happening just with the grazing, that are with the animals that have come back. So really that led us then to have a think about how we can apply what we've been learning into beyond grazing, so into cropping and horticulture and other areas. And that's what we're going to touch on today, is where we've got to with Tiverton and how we go about our work. But I'm really delighted to introduce Kym today. Kym teamed up with Tiverton. We formed a joint venture a few years ago, and it's been super exciting because it's really enabled us to advance the work that we're doing on the farms. But Kym, would you like to just introduce yourself and give a little bit about your amazing background?
Thanks, Nigel. Good morning, everybody. I guess I kind of link my background back to my father's generation. He was a wheat and sheep farmer back in South Australia, in the southern states of Australia, where I grew up. And unfortunately, the family farm didn't continue. And then I spent the next 20 or 30 years looking at ways that I could get involved in agriculture. So I did a lot of work on school holidays and family friends' farms and things of that nature. And around 2002, I had the really fortunate opportunity to go and live in Japan and study integrated rice and duck farming. And that taught me a lot about integrated ecology and also natural systems, and the way that farming could actually integrate ecology into productive organic agricultural production. So that then led me to, over the next decade, I guess, look at ways that I could actually have an influence on the information that was getting out there within the public domain. And with a group of friends, we decided to form a company that we thought was a good idea, called Regen Ag, as an abbreviation of regenerative agriculture, as an education and consulting business, where we would conduct courses and events all over the country for farmers and consumers alike in the range of different regenerative agriculture methodologies, integrated methodologies with experts from all over the world, both here in Australia, but also folks from the US and Latin America, all over the place. And we thought regenerative agriculture, or regen ag, was a good name at the time because there's so much that needs to be done with the agricultural space beyond sustainability, and so that kept me engaged in that field for, I'd say, close to a decade before I then specialised in the world of biological and mineral-based inputs. And so my most recent history, I guess over the last 10 years, has been in the manufacturing on-farm of liquid biological and mineral-based fertilisers. And that has led me to being teaming up with Nigel and the Tiverton team and meeting these wonderful people to then commercialise what it is that we used to do on a farm-by-farm basis. So for the last 5 or 6 years, we've gone through a whole process of commercialisation. Education is still very much at the core. It's something I feel passionate about. And we're at a point now where we have a commercial product on scale, and we've been trialling that over the last 5 or 6 years on around 20,000 hectares of all different crop types, from dryland cropping to horticulture to pasture. And we'll go through some of the results that we've achieved over that period of time. But that's my story up until today. Thanks, Nigel.
Thank you, Kym. As I touched on, when we were doing the Tiverton farm and we wanted to start looking at other types of farms, and this was around 2016, we invested with a group of high net worth in a couple of properties with the concept of looking at the master plan of those properties, both in how we look at food production, forestry and biodiversity recovery in this healthy balance. And clearly, we can't expand our biodiversity and forestry piece at the expense of food production. So we came across Kym. We were doing a lot of composting at the time, I should say, prior to meeting Kym, and a few of the worm juices and things. And we knew that we needed to get a little bit more comprehensive with our outcomes if we're going to improve our productivity. And as Dan talks a lot about the nutrient density of the food as well, and be able to then perhaps put the lower productive areas back into corridor plantings and biodiverse plantings of some meaning. So we invested in a couple of farms with our investors as a means to learn, basically, and learn we did, even though Harry and I got long farming backgrounds, because we were sort of trailblazing for ourselves into these new areas. We did have a lot of learnings, and I guess we're very fortunate that our investors were up for us to go down this pathway, because everything new has some ups and downs. Even when we started, breeding the threatened species and recovering, it's exactly the same pathway, because a lot of the work that we're all doing, and a lot of the listeners here today are doing, is new, and it's the sharing piece that's going to get us there. But we'll touch on a few of the learnings or failures that helped us learn further on how we got forward. But at Arana, just referring to the photograph here, it's a 6,000 hectare, just under 6,000 hectare farm, which we've put 1,000 hectares into an olive grove, and that's the Maximus olive harvester you're looking at there. And we're cropping a bit over 3,000 hectares, and we've got the balance into a biodiverse sanctuary where we're breeding the local endangered species to cut, and then we've built some corridors through that farm. So probably a ratio of this farm is now at about probably 85% food production, 15% biodiversity. Our objective generally is to be closer to 25% into forestry or biodiversity of farms, and sometimes we can get the ratio up higher. But the model, as we've continued to learn, was then to look at obviously other forms of income, and carbon became something that we got very interested in. And then how do we bring down the cost of the measurement? And Dan is such a great advocate of the criticality of measuring what we're doing, so we can see how we're advancing. And Kym's going to touch on some of that today, but we started investing into some technology as well to help us with those with that pathway. So overall, maybe move to the next slide there, Kym. The master planning piece is critical for us. So and with Kym, we've really got a lot into pre-assessment, multiple types of tests, both physical and technological, to determine the pathway of how we can set something up to build the soils such that we can enhance food production and nutrition and be sequestering a lot of carbon, but rejuvenating the local biodiversity. So that's the pathway of our mission, and through that we developed these businesses. So on the left there, the Tiverton farms. So that's sort of where we've got farms, and we're working with multiple farms now. The Arana farm I touched on, just under 6,000 hectares. The Jamia farms, 6,500 hectares. We're working with some large sheep farms as well, large cattle farms that are partner farms as opposed to Tiverton-owned farms. But the objective was, can we apply our principles and our products and expertise across grazing, cropping, and horticulture, and then within those fields, sheep and cattle grazing, and the cropping, wheat, barley, vetch, sorghum, canola, and there's more of those. And then on the horticulture space, we've been working mainly with olives and table and wine grapes to be able to see how we can advance. Our Circle Ag business, which is our joint venture with Kym, and Kym's going to touch a lot more on Circle Ag, but that's how we've developed our own liquid biofertilizer product that we can enhance our food productivity and food quality. We've been delighted with the results the last 4 years, and I say the last 4 years because once we got the product together, we wanted to prove that this work could all happen at scale, because if we're going to influence or assist other farmers or transform an industry, it's critical that we've got farms of scale doing this work and proving that it's a profitable outcome. So we've been wanting to get to that point where we could, over this last 4-year period, show and benchmark our farms in the various work that we're doing, that it is more profitable to work this way. We can enhance farm income with carbon, and we own a carbon business called Carbon Neutral. That business is focused on the tree planting pieces of carbon. We're doing soil carbon separately through Tiverton, but with Carbon Neutral, it's environmental plantings, and that business is, I think we've planted over 30 million trees so far. In Australia, there's a regulated legislated carbon industry, and we work within that, but we also work with the global voluntary carbon market as well. And in Australia, we have the gold standard carbon, which is where the majority of the 30 million trees have been planted through that system. And then I mentioned earlier that we had invested in technologies. The one we invested in about 4 years ago now, Downforce Technologies, which we came across. Professor Jackie McGlade, who'd come from Oxford University, was commercialising Downforce Technologies, which is a remote algorithm measurement of soil carbon. And in Australia, and I think everywhere, if you're measuring soil carbon with cores and labs, it's a very expensive process. And we were trying to find something that we could use quite regularly to measure our progress. And so we shared with Jackie all of the GPS points of our many soil tests, and we were quite surprised and delighted actually that there was a correlation was above 93%. And at that point, we invested into Downforce Technologies and have worked closely with them ever since. And what we're finding now is that it's so cost effective that we can do regular swoops of our farms and get a gauge not just of how well the soil carbon and the biomass is performing, but Jackie's also starting to give us advice on what we might have done on one crop versus another, because she can see the difference in the performance. So the more cost effective these technologies can get, the better from all of us. And even in the biodiversity space with eDNA, I think a lot of people have heard about that these days. There's more and more technologies emerging that are going to make this a great pathway. So I was going to hand across to Kym now to talk about our healthy soil journey. So over to you, Kym.
Oh, thanks, Nigel. Yeah, as Nigel mentioned before, when I first met Nigel and Harry and the whole Tiverton team, they were heavily into compost, and my journey up until that point in time had been to assist farmers in setting up their own scale appropriate manufacturing facilities. So I worked with all scales of farmers, right from very small to ultimately what ended up being quite large, 3,000-4,000 hectare dryland cropping farmers. So with Tiverton, we started in that fashion, in that manner, and I think it was December or January that we started manufacturing products to be used in sowing and cropping that coming year. In the March, April kind of sowing period. So within a very quick period of time, and looking back at how we started to where we are today, it's been quite a significant journey to take what was very much an on-farm practice and turn that into a commercial reality, and not just in the refinement of the recipes and as we've improved and done a lot of R&D over the last 4 or 5 years, and a lot of analysis and testing to understand and to tweak the product and get it to organic status, but probably more so the manufacturing process and all of the equipment required to be able to manufacture what is today at the R&D facility around 3 million litres per year. And that 3 million litres is going out, as Nigel's mentioned, across dryland cropping, so wheat, barley, canola, vetch, chickpeas, faba beans, as well as 1,000 hectares of olives, as well as pasture, and now into vegetables. And basically, if the plant is growing in soil, then the flagship product, which is Circle Min BioFert, works extremely effectively. And the reason that it works extremely effectively is because it's helping to address these, what I call the 3 legs of the stool. So no matter what it is that we're farming, whatever landscape we're managing for productive agriculture, we're having to manage these 3 components: organic matter, microbes, and minerals. They're constantly interacting with each other, and the interplay between them determines a whole range of things, from water holding capacity to nutrient cycling ability, the amount of air that you have in your soil, which in turn the degree of biological activity, gaseous exchange with the movement of carbon dioxide and water, and ultimately crop performance and soil organic carbon formation. So the biofertilizer itself has a range of different minerals in a chelated and biologically available form. So we've got the mineral component covered. The microorganisms are essential for making those minerals available, and that's very much part of the process. Microbes that are both living but also in spore form. And then we have organic carbon, organic compounds within the biofertilizer as well, making it extremely effective both as a soil applied input as well as a foliar application. So the range of minerals that we have within the biofert, there would be over 70 different chelated and complex minerals within the biofertilizer. The process that we use is roughly a 30-day anaerobic digestion process, and during that period of time, starting with a nature-derived inoculum. The whole process of making biofertilizer that we use is very much a form of biomimicry. So we're starting with a very broad spectrum nature-derived inoculum, to which we add foods to help grow the population and stimulate those microorganisms. We then provide minerals to those microorganisms. The microbes then digest, complex, chelate those microbes through the process of anaerobic fermentation. And what we end up with at the end is a three-in-one type product, where we have the mineral component that's bioavailable to the plant as well as to soil microorganisms. There's thousands of species of bacteria and fungi, many of which that are in spore form. They're encapsulated in a hard exterior spore. Once applied to the environment, once applied to the soil, and there's moisture in a plant that's photosynthesizing, producing sugars, they then wake up and proliferate and perform their functions equally when they're applied to the surface of the leaf of the plant. They have a protective mechanism. We've had the product analyzed for over 250 different microbially derived secondary metabolites. So there's enzymes and hormones and vitamins, microbial communication or signaling molecules, and there's a lot of secondary metabolites within the product that help the plant to deal with biotic and abiotic stress. There's also a range of different amino acids which are microbially derived through the process. So the product, it ends up being something that is a byproduct of the manufacturing process as opposed to being a mix of ingredients. So much the same as you and I would eat an apple, we're not actually eating the apple, we're macerating the apple, we're breaking it up into small pieces. Enzymes in our mouth are digesting it, and the microorganisms in our gut are actually extracting the nutrients out of the apple. The manufacturing of the biofertilizer is a very similar type process, where it's a biomimetic process where the microbes are doing the work, akin to what happens in the soil, a little bit what happens in the soil where roots or plant roots would exude acids to solubilize minerals, and microorganisms produce enzymes to help solubilize minerals. We're fast tracking that process so that we can address immediate deficiencies and imbalances and ensure that the plant has its full nutritional requirement met through application in a simulatory way. Because ultimately we want the plant to do the work, and the biofertilizer works a little bit like shiatsu in that it is a soil and plant probiotic that helps stimulate both the plant and the microbiome within the soil. Another input, we have around 11 or 12 different things that we make, the biofertilizer being the flagship product, but another one that we manufacture and we use regularly is liquid humic acid, which is very common within regenerative practices and also now quite common within the conventional space. But we use humic acid for a range of reasons, for the benefits that it brings both from a chemistry standpoint to a physical standpoint and to a biological. So we use humic acid on all synthetic fertilizer as a coating. We provide that carbon source and the benefit that humic acid has from the point of view of chelation. Every granule, if it's a synthetic granule that goes out, gets coated with liquid humic acid. We also use humic acid granules at sowing to buffer phosphorus inputs so that we don't get that immediate lockup and we get a longer sustained release of phosphorus over the course of the growing season. We'll back again to liquid. We'll use that at direct injection in dryland cropping. In this photo you see here is where we direct injected humic acid into the ground at the time of sowing on the right-hand side versus not directing it on the left-hand side. And sometimes we use it as a foliar as well because of that chelation benefit, but more often than not in foliars we'll tend to use fulvic acid, which is another thing that we make. So the benefit to the biology really is, especially in the fungi, in the olives that Nigel mentions in particular, using humic acid has seen a multitude of benefits, particularly on the development of the fungal population, particularly mycorrhizal fungi. We've seen over a 12,000, not 1,200, a 12,000% increase in mycorrhizal population as measured by a PLFA, or phospholipid fatty acid test that we get conducted in the United States. That 1,200% increase has occurred since 2020. And in part, the humic acid has played a role in that. Humic acid's also played a role in the olive grove in terms of unlocking and releasing the potassium that's locked up in the clay. So we do baseline soil testing as a starting point to understand what bank of minerals we have in the soil. One thing is to see what's available, but we always want to know what we've got in reserve, what we could potentially unlock. And when we did the baseline soil testing on the olive grove, we found there was a massive supply of potassium, but being quite a heavy clay soil, it was really locked up by being compressed within clay platelets within the soil. So again, using humic acid has really helped to flocculate that soil, which then releases the potassium out into soil solution and enables the olive plants to actually take it up. So by using by understanding that the potassium was there to begin with and using strategies to unlock it, we've been able to use a very minimal amount of external supplementary potassium and have the olives adequately supplied with potassium through the soil, through the activity of microorganisms, and a little bit of tweaking of the chemistry with using humic acid to unlock the bank that existed. And likewise with the olives, we've been very fortunate. Humic acid is a great benefit with root stimulation, and we've been very fortunate. We've had the olives from birth. That old saying, give me an olive tree until it's 7 years of age and I'll turn it into anything that you want. So these trees have had the biofertilizer and the humic acids and the other biological stimulants and mineral-based input right from the beginning. And that's really ensured that they've got good, robust, strong early root growth, similar to what we see here with the vetch on the right-hand side. And that establishment phase is obviously really critical. Again, much like children, you provide the environment, and early environment is absolutely critical to long-term success. So Nigel mentioned before about downforce technology, which is a really valuable tool, both for measurement of soil organic carbon, but also as a management monitoring tool to see how effective different practices and different approaches are. One of the beauties that I feel of downforce is your ability to go back 6 or 7 years and see what the fluctuations and changes in soil organic carbon has been, as well as being able to project 25 years forward to tell you what your potential is. So a few of the tools or a few of the ways in which they're able to classify or measure, on the left-hand side there we've got soil classification. So what they do there is they're mapping the different soil types and their spatial distribution across your property, and it's a very high resolution of around 10 square metre pixels. And for that, they're using data sources, including existing soil survey and mapping data, spectral analysis, electromagnetic conductivity and gamma radiation readings, topographical and geographical characteristics. So they're accessing an entire data bank that, potentially you and I can both also access, but there's more to the downforce story than just the access to publicly available data sets. The practical value of that in understanding what soil distribution you have across your landscape is it reveals the variability across the farm. So different soil types respond very differently to management practices and carbon sequestration potential. So this allows for targeted interventions tailored to each soil type. The middle one there is soil moisture. So downforce measures and monitors soil moisture dynamics across the property over time using satellite and sensor data. Now, some of the sensor data includes current moisture status, historical moisture variability, 6+ years of data every 10 days, and seasonal interannual patterns over time. So through that process, the practical value of understanding soil moisture across your farm is it then becomes a very strong indicator and driver of soil carbon dynamics and microbial activity. So areas with high moisture variability are often indicative of vulnerability to climate stress, drought and flood. And I've got a slide coming up that shows you the impact of inundation of moisture on soil organic carbon, which was a great learning for us. And also the loss of soil carbon stability. It helps you identify areas where soil carbon is resilient as well as being potentially at risk. So they are two of the main data sets that influence the strategic carbon storage areas. I think it's something around 26 different data sets that downforce uses that are publicly available, and then there's 2 or 3 that are not publicly available, directly connected to European satellites. And the machine learning and software that they've developed to be able to crunch all of that data, as Nigel said, with the GPS reference to soil cores, gave in excess of 93% accuracy of soil carbon down to 30 centimetres. So it's extremely impressive. So this last pass of the strategic carbon storage areas, these zones are identified as having the greatest potential for soil organic carbon sequestration and stability. And that's based on the current soil organic carbon level or existing carbon stocks, the soil organic carbon variability, so that's how stable the carbon is year to year and seasonally, the maximum soil organic carbon capacity, so that's the upper limit the soil can theoretically hold under that particular land use, soil type and climate compatibility, and also historical management performance. And that's the interesting part, being able to go back 6 years and see these dark strips and go, well, hang on a minute, what did we do there? Oh, that's right, that's where we put 3 or 4 applications of biofertilizer, and that actually shows up within the reports. So the practical value of having that strategic carbon storage area mapped out is that it stratifies the property into highest and best use zones to allow you to target your management practices. It identifies where those interventions, whether they're cover crops or biofertilizer or changing your tillage practices, etc., will deliver the greatest carbon sequestration bang for buck, and that enables you to precisely target on-farm programs and invest in particular strategies within carbon projects. So this is data directly from Downforce Technology report on the olive grove. And it's interesting there in 2020 is when we first started. So 2021 was the first year that biofertilizer was applied to the olive grove. And this is a graph showing the increased water holding capacity that we've achieved over time as we've built soil organic carbon across the olive grove. So you can see this steady incremental increase, or quite a significant increase, going from 2020 to 2021, 2020 being baseline, 21, we saw a jump, 22, we saw a jump, 23, we had a flood. So in 23, you see this dip into the water holding capacity of the soil because of the impact that the flood had on the structure of the soil. I mean, the number one most important thing to have in your soil, as everyone knows, is air. And when you half the grove was inundated with flood water, then you see air bubbling out of the soil and has a direct impact upon the structure. However, what was most interesting is the bounce back in 2024. So across the whole grove, which is 1,000 hectares, we have increased since 2020 the soil's ability to hold on to moisture by about 83 million litres, which is roughly 83,000 litres per hectare. So this assumes a soil mass of around 1.3 tonne per square metre down to 30 centimetres, which is around 3,900 tonnes a hectare. Some of you might be familiar with Dr. Christine Jones's work in Australia that spoke to a 1% increase in soil organic carbon on 1 hectare is 144,000 litres of extra water holding capacity. It's not necessarily a dollar saving in an irrigation project like the olives is. If it's only 2 days of growth, that's not the main benefit. But the benefit is, what about early season rain events where you soak in the water? Soils with lower organic matter do not do that. The difference between effective and ineffective rainfall, as they talk about in holistic management and Alan Savory's work, it perpetuates an ideal environment for longer for microbes to function within the soil. Obviously, if you're getting water infiltrate into the soil and the soil has the ability to act like a sponge, that's preventing erosion. So there's more going in. 600 mil rainfall annually is the equivalent of 3 44-gallon drums stacked on every square metre of land. There's less surface evaporation, so you've got this prolonged access by the crop in between rain events, so it brings about this resilience. And you've also got enhanced nutrient movement, things like potassium. When more water is held within the root zone, nutrients, potassium and other nutrients dissolve in soil solution and more consistently supplied during critical growth phases, as opposed to the soil drying up and the plant not only unable to access moisture, but also unable to access nutrients because of the soil's inability to hold and store moisture. So within the group, I'm sure I don't need to speak a lot about the decline in nutrition within food. There's lots of studies showing long-term declines in mineral and vitamin concentrations. I think Andy Warhol might have said that when somebody asks, we know we're in trouble when someone asks, would you like an orange? And they say, an orange what? I think it's actually possible these days to get an orange that has no vitamin C. The level of iron within meat is reduced by 50%. Milk, vegetables, grandma's tomatoes used to taste and smell and have the colour. Conventional tomatoes today, you put them on the chopping board and they tend to kind of fall apart with no structure. We've seen it ourselves with tomatoes in a side-by-side comparison that we've grown using biological and mineral-based inputs, where the worst that happens with the tomato is it dehydrates as it sits on top of the fridge. because it's full of minerals. Minerals are heavy. Minerals are so critical to the health and the performance of the crop that you're growing, but equally, obviously, they're critically important for ourselves. Zinc, I think, is responsible or a cofactor around 300 different enzymatic functions within a plant. Similarly, zinc is absolutely critical for humans as well. And I think someone once said that the problem with global agriculture is we're stuck in this productivist mentality. It's about how many square widgets per square meter as opposed to the quality of those widgets. And that's very much what our focus is with what we do in working with clients and the manufacturing the biofertilizer, is to enhance the nutritional value of the crop that's being grown, which in turn provides us with healthy food to enhance the nutritional support of humans that eat that food. So a few of the case studies, the 1,000-hectare olive grove actually started producing oil around 12 to 18 months ahead of schedule, which itself was really impressive. We had the trees in a very healthy state that they were able to produce, what was a small yield to begin with, but now that yield is ramping up, and we're now in year 6, and olive is in full productive capacity by year 8. And every single drop of oil that has come off the grove has been classified as extra virgin olive oil. The way that they measure extra virgin olive oil is by measuring the free fatty acids. So free fatty acids under the level of under 0.8 is considered to be extra virgin olive oil. If the free fatty acid level is under 0.3, it goes directly into the black label olive oil that the offtake company that processes the olive sells in supermarkets. Our olives coming off the grove have been at a free fatty acid level of 0.17. So in part, that's to do with the nutritional program that's being run, but also largely it's to do with the organisation and the packaging and the shipping of the olives to get them to the processing facility within a short period of time. So that's how long it's taking for the bins to fill, how long the bins are sitting there, and how quickly the olives are getting to the processing facility to extract the oil. But certainly the olive tree's ability to be able to produce those produce oil in the first place is directly linked to a nutritional plane, a nutritional profile. In lands, we've had a similar result. Harry Youngman, Nigel's business partner in Circle Ag, also runs a fat lamb operation on his farm in the southwest of Victoria of Australia. And one of the things that we wanted to look at there was why Harry's lambs had gone from 18 kilos to 24 kilos over the same period of growth. Why are these lambs putting on so much weight? And so we did a little bit of a whole supply chain analysis where we looked at the soil and what minerals were in the soil. We then looked at the leaf tissue to see what was flowing through to the leaf that the animals were eating. We did a fecal analysis of the animal whilst they were living to see the level of digestibility within the animal. At the time when the animals were processed, we actually accessed some of the stomach fluid to have a look at the volatile fatty acids that were being produced. Harry had an extremely high level of volatile fatty acids within his lambs, and the volatile fatty acids that provide 75–80% of the energy of the animal. So we could see there was this real spike in the energy available that was coming through the nutrition of the plants the animals were eating. And ultimately, we tested the loin meat to see the quality of the meat as being produced. Now, Harry now jokes that his lamb is almost as good as salmon, salmon being one of the best sources of omega-3. It's not quite salmon, but it's extremely high. It's actually at a level that is considered by the Heart Foundation to be a good source of omega-3. So Harry's telling everyone to eat more of his lamb because it's good for your heart. But it's a fascinating insight into tracking everything from the soil all the way through to the animals so we can see the quality that's being produced. And lastly here, the canola in one particular year, I think it was 2024, and this has been consistent across the board that we had a 2.2% higher oil content compared to the surrounding district. And obviously, if you've got a higher oil content, then you fetch a higher price for your canola. So one thing is yield, another thing is the quality of what's being produced. And quality is something that we see consistently across the board improve as we start to get healthier soils, in particular using the biofertilizer helps achieve that. So as mentioned, that first harvest occurred a year or so earlier in the olives. We're now up to producing around 6,500 tonnes this year. That will go up again as the olives go into year 6. That increase in lamb weight, another key statistic from Harry is 70% of the animals were ready for sale at weaning. That's at 20 weeks. So that's straight off mum. 70% of the animals were ready for sale straight off their mother. So obviously there's the nutritional flow from the mother through to the lamb. And then calving in his beef operation as well, he exceeded benchmarks where Harry had yields of around 406 kilos per hectare in 2024 and about 432 kilos the year before that in 2023. So that equates to around 76 kilograms per hectare per 100 mil of rainfall. And that's really outstanding. And Harry's part of a very robust benchmarking group, and he is in that regard around 50% higher per hectare than his benchmarking group, which is a really outstanding result.
Thank you, Kym. Kym, just before I take off again, just moving to this healthy people slide, can you just touch on what we've been finding with the sides, pesticide, herbicide, fungicide use based on a requirement based on the Circle Egg results?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess one of the foundational principles that I've always followed in working within this space is if the nutritional requirement of a crop is being met, it is less susceptible to pests and disease. It's actually a term or a word that's used called trophobiosis, which explains the link between nutrition and disease. And it was a word developed in a book written by a French agronomist called Chabossel, I believe in the 90s, I can't quite recall. But that theory of trophobiosis explains the link between nutrition and disease. So the theory goes that if a plant has its nutritional requirement met, and it is fully functional in its metabolism and ability to photosynthesize, ability to produce secondary metabolites, both for its own protection, its phytochemicals that form part of its immune system, as well as its recruiting mechanisms through all of the exudates. We call them sugar, but obviously there's a whole range of other secondary metabolites plants produce and leak out through into the soil to communicate and to foster relationship with microorganisms that can perform a function for them. The more that a plant's nutritional requirement is met, the higher its ability to actually be able to do all of those things effectively. The other thing is plants are always going through a process of protein breakdown and protein formation. And the more balanced the nutrition is within the plant, the more balanced that process of protein breakdown and protein accumulation is. So if we can have a plant within a state where there are less freely available amino acids and simple sugars for insects and for fungal pathogens to feast upon, then the less likely it is that that plant is going to be attacked by those organisms in the first place. And that subsequently means that we don't have to be using these harsh chemical interventions as a way to stamp out disease, even though we'll keep them in our back pocket if we absolutely need to use them. But we actually empower the plant to be able to defend itself. The vast majority of insects can't actually break down protein. So Nigel and I could eat a steak and we could both break it down into amino acids. Nigel could use those amino acids to make more Nigel and I could use it to make more Kym. But insects, the vast majority of those that attack our crops can't actually do that. They need those amino acids. So if we have a plant that is not quite nutritionally balanced, and it has a lot of those amino acids and simple sugars, which is the calling card for red-legged earth mites and aphids and every other thing within the district to come and feast upon them, because the role of insects is to clean up the sick and the wounded, then that is what you will bring in. So we're constantly working at prevention being better than cure, having a plant in a nutritional stable state, and the biofertilizer helps with that, such that we don't need to, and we've had that experience where we just do not need to be using fungicides and pesticides because we have the plant being able to defend itself and be optimal in its metabolic function and performance.
Thank you, Kym. I was moving on here to talk a bit more about the healthy people, and on this slide here, it's like, how do we communicate this? I think we all get the picture, and Dan has got the message very clear on getting into measurement of nutrient density. The results that we're getting across all the different farms that we're working with in the agricultural produce is giving us the confidence and to talk about how we assist other farmers on the journey. And part of Healthy People is about healthy farmers as well. And our model now has evolved, that we've got key farms that we work with, we own and work with, and other partner farms that we work with. And now it's like, how do we help other farmers transition? And we're getting to this point of, how do we get people, farmers, confident to the transformation? How do we transform this industry? And pretty much it's coming down to a formula that we're working to, which is proof at scale, plus education, plus enablement to get to transformation. And the proof at scale piece is one around demonstrating this quality of food, but also the productivity of the farm, the ecosystem health at the farm, and then of number one importance is the profitability of the farm. We don't think we can transition and transform agriculture without demonstrating this whole profitability piece. So proof at scale includes those different parts. Education, which is where Kym comes in to help us in chatting to farmers. And then the enablement piece is why we've developed the businesses of Circle Ag and Carbon Neutral and invested in downforce technology, so that it's we can make the change, and we can measure the change, and we can confidently share the scaled outcomes. So the biggest message from us now, and the direction of Tiverton now, is to assist farmers who want to make the change, whether they be investors or landholders. So Healthy People is is the health of the consumer as well, which I think Dan sells the message better than anybody here. But we are working in different partnerships. And as I said, Dan and I met with the Farm My School people in Bellarine Peninsula. They're about to expand their operation to Colac to another farm, and are getting inquiries all over the world. And this education piece of working with schools who are going to develop out really large vegetable gardens, much larger than what the school needs. I think Bellarine Peninsula's got 3.2 kilometres of vegetables growing, and so Circle Ag's partnering up to help those, provide product to those schools so that they can expand as well. And the Deakin Food and Mood Centre, Dan has touched on as well, with Professor Felice Jacker, and this nutritional psychiatry piece. Again, if we're producing the right food, there's just more and more science showing the evidence of the outcome for our health. And in Melbourne, we've recently set up a Sky Farm, which is growing vegetables in the CBD of Melbourne, so that we can demonstrate again that the value of growing food that is nutrient rich. So I think we need to be thinking across that broad scale. With climate and ecosystems, as Kym's touched on here, our healthy soils are sequestering a lot of carbon, and Jackie's quote is amazing. If we get all of the world increasing the soil carbon by 2 or 3%, you actually go a long way to solving all of the atmospheric carbon. We're also very interested in these large-scale revegetation projects too, which are demonstrating around the world that it can influence the rainfall events, which is what farming needs to think about, and it helps us all understand that master planning or land use across the areas that are being farmed. And we're thinking throughout Australia, but it works globally, obviously, as well. Carbon neutral, as I said, we've planted in one corridor alone, which is the northern part of the Western Australian wheat belt, 30 million trees. It's a super large planting, and the way that we're looking at corridors is on landscape scale, but also, as I said before, when we get a farm, we try and look at master planning that farm for how the corridor piece works. So the healthy climate piece, we can sequester an enormous amount of carbon into the soil, and with all of our tree planting across landscape scale plantings as well, that has a large influence. Jackie's quote there is quite remarkable. 1% is the same as 50 years of US emissions. What we're finding across our farms is that, you know, the farms in the wetter areas like Harry's area, you know, can be increasing soil carbon by up to 10%. The sandier soils, you know, it's probably 2 to 3%, but it's just showing globally to get all of our soil increasing its carbon by 1% is not that big a challenge once we get the soil function working as Kym has described. When we're doing our ecosystem work and the environmental plantings for the trees across the farms and across the landscape, we've learned, actually, can you go back, Kym? Yeah, we've been looking really at the influence of animals, and we've worked a bit with Oz Smith at Yale as well. So the animals start to really influence soil functionality, and where we've reintroduced some of the native animals to the landscapes in Australia, we've started to see plants and fungi return that we couldn't get happening without their assistance. This importance of the fauna in our ecosystem is getting clearer and clearer. We recently were selected by the Amazon Right Now Climate Fund. This is the Odonata Foundation that works with Tiverton in this threatened species area as their first project in Australia to back the 505 plan, as we call it. And that is bringing back species that are next to extinction, but we can demonstrate their value in the ecosystem, and then they can help us rebuild and accelerate the revegetation parts of our work. So we're finding that we can work with the species in grazing operations. Clearly, with cropping, it's different, and that's where we need the corridors of the sanctuary piece to make it work. But as we add more ecosystem health to each farm, clearly all of the other farming health and soil and insects, there's so many benefits that flow from this master plan type thinking. So this slide, basically the healthy balance, it is all about health, healthy soil, healthy plants, healthy food, healthy people. It all adds together, and it forms a great mantra for Tiverton as an operation and a group as to where we want to go. What's the next slide there, Kym? Yeah, well, you know, Dan's great work on nutrient density, IUCN guidelines. There's so many different global movements building around here, and I think it's upon us to keep on researching and learning and experimenting to advance the work that we're doing and continue to share with everybody our work and go on this pathway with Dan at the moment. And we're really enjoying supporting Dan to get his treaty up. There's no doubt, as we've learned with downforce technologies, that getting really strong measurement back into our staff and everybody understanding where we're going to go and where we have come from is leading to the change that drives confidence. And Dan's story of getting nutrient density recognised or defined and then ultimately more cost effectively measured. We see it a bit like our soil carbon process. It was costing us a lot to measure it all 10 years ago, and it's way more cost effective now. As that gets cost effective, it helps drive the change that we all need. So for us, our scaling model at the moment is that we want to get some more demonstration farms around Australia and start setting up more circle ag plants so that we can take farmers on that journey. We've got global interest in our circle ag product, and we've got a couple of countries we're discussing licenses presently. we've put there promoting nutritional agriculture. We're sort of adopting that term with the way that we're working at the moment, and it's really it's trying to just point out that we need to measure everything, because there's methodologies, but I guess Dan really alerted us to the fact with his carrot study that the fact that there was not much correlation between the different farming types. So if we can measure everything, we know that we're going to assist with the change and assist Dan with his work. Expanding our biodiverse carbon planting projects is significant. We're working on a new project which is 100 million trees at the moment, which we're starting to get all of our nursery orders. So this is one of these bring back the rain scale type projects, and we're finding that this can work alongside productive farming, where as Kym was talking with the olives and the sheep and the cropping outcomes, where we can increase productivity on the higher productive land, and then we can bring in the biodiverse corridor planting projects to assist with the change at that broader landscape, from that broader landscape perspective. We're expanding the threatened species recovery programs. I think we've got 9 species now that we've been working with that were about to become extinct. When we started working with the eastern barred bandicoot, there was less than 100 of them in the world, and they were genetically impaired. And we worked with genetic scientists and returned that species. I think there's 6,000 of those across 5 different locations now. Brush-tailed rock wallabies was the same. I think there was 39 of them left when we started working with those, and their numbers have expanded considerably, and we've got a number of stories around that. But the point of this species work is the same as what we're finding in agriculture. There's a lot to learn, and a lot of these learnings lead to multiple outcomes from the approach that we're taking. And right now we're about to launch a new fund so that we can get more demonstration farms across Australia and potentially outside Australia, some of those points that we're chatting to Dan about at the moment. So Dan, over to you for your questions, I think.
And engagement. That was so brilliant. That was so brilliant. I mean, every time I talk to you and understand what you're doing as one human being on this planet systemically to solve problems, I've just totally touched. And I didn't say it as the intro, but we're extremely grateful to have you join our board of directors for the BFA this summer. So really honored to have that. Kym, do you mind turning the slideshow off so we can see our faces bigger? Beautiful, thank you. Great. Yeah, well, so this is the time for people who want to engage to put your questions in the Q&A box. I don't see any in there yet, so first come, first served. I'll be engaging Kym and Nigel with a series of questions I've jotted down here in the next half hour. We'd like to save that last half hour for engagement. So, boy, I just I don't know. It's the system thinking, the looking back, the pattern forming, the verification, and then the intention, the hubris, the what is it? It's the impetuousness, the that drive to actually cause the world to be a better place. It's just, it feels tangible and plausible in this work, and I just want to give you kudos for everything you're doing. I'm, like I said, every time I talk to you, I'm totally impressed, and so yeah, I'll start with that. Let me see, if just for a few technical things to reiterate and sort of delve into. Kym, when you were talking about the ingredients in the mix, I just want to review for people what we're talking about here. You are taking a soil test, so you're looking at what the underlying mineral levels and ratios are in the soil, and if there are things that are not present, you understand that they need to be augmented, and if there are things that are present and not available, that needs to be facilitated as well. but primarily you're doing it's an anaerobic ferment. I don't think you told people the number of liters per hectare at which it's applied. Was it 30 or something?
Sure. Yes, it's anaerobic fermentation, and yes, we start with that baseline soil testing to get an understanding of not only the chemistry but the biology as well. So we use the Haney test as a measure of that, as well as PLFA, phospholipid fatty acid, which is a bit of a helicopter view of what's going on biologically, because we need to, if we're going to manage biological systems, then we need to be able to measure what's going on with the biology as well. So we use both of those tests in conjunction, as well as a total test within the Haney, to see what's available, how the microorganisms are functioning, what food sources they have available to them, what balance there is, what the totals are saying, and try to unpack the puzzle of why, if there's a bank of minerals, certain things are not available. So immediately with the biofertilizer, it's very broad spectrum mineral nutrition, but then subject to those soil test analysis and the biological interpretation, we can then tweak the recipe to spike this mineral, spike that mineral, see the need to, more fungal foods or more bacterial foods to balance things up and customize the application for soil applications. And likewise, during the season with SAP testing, we take the same approach.
So you're literally making a unique mix for each farm based on your testing of identifying what its imbalances are, which I think is not the norm, right? I mean, people can buy products, but it's a uniform.
Yeah, sure.
And this is a feedback loop here that's going on, which I don't know. I don't know if I mean, like you said, you've taught farmers how to do this and things. And in many cases, people say, look, the farmer's like, yeah, okay, I'm actually happy to pay you for it if you can do it and do it well. And then the scale you're talking significant.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's kind of the point we got to, Dan, is that we were teaching more and more farmers, but we had more and more farmers coming to us going, well, that's fantastic. We'd love to do this, but I just don't have the time. And so I'm always looking, I guess, my whole driver with getting involved in this space 20 odd years ago is how to impact change, how to affect change. And obviously through education and empowerment, that's an extremely powerful tool to do that. But then if we really want to impact and affect change, then, through the partnership with Tiverton and creating Circle Ag and being able to manufacture this on scale and keep it at a price that is then affordable for farmers to do, farmers quite often, they've got enough to do. And so if they can access something that is affordable for them and they don't have to make it, that's kind of what we're being able to do with Circle Ag.
Yeah. Dan, one of the points with that is that, we've had to, because of this bespoke model where clearly every soil is different and we need to treat every farm differently, is that we've invested heavily in a automated manufacturing design so that we can tweak the product inputs for each farm order. So it's now that it's quite comprehensive and it's quite complicated to do that, but the key that we've had to work on the last 2 years is to be able to deliver that, but sell the product so that it's cost effective, it's price competitive with any other fertilizer, and at the moment we're very competitive on price, and that's where it was getting challenging for farmers making their own as well, not just the time, but because there's many inputs here. When you set up the logistics chain of getting those together, it's a lot for someone to manage. Farmers having to put on staff to try and do that for themselves. So it was costing 2 or 3 times what we can deliver. Just a little anecdote story too, because when you were just chatting then about the call it the recipe or whatever, but Kym and I were going to do a presentation one day, and we were trying to work out what's a simple term we can use to describe in brief what it was, and we came up with the term bomber, and it was BOMMER, and that was so biological, organic, mineral metabolite microbes, enzyme and vitamin rich. So clearly we couldn't get the V in there. Anyway, it turns out that one of our investors was doing some homework, or someone who wanted to get involved and use Circle Ag, a farmer. And I was with him one day and he goes, "You guys, that's really clever, that bomber." And I was sort of saying, "Oh, yeah, well, it's just a description of that." And he said, "Oh, really?" He said, "I thought it must have been to do with George Bomber, American farmer in 1853 who was into fermentation for agriculture. So there was this. So
No
we've got
idea.
a new hero called George Bomber, and it was a stumble across.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, well, I mean, but the point is, a lot of farmers are operating on scale. A lot of farmers operating on scale do buy things. And if you're able to sort of do a plug and play model, which is integrating all these dynamics of the biological ag system at price parity or below, and cause, decreases in pest and disease pressure, better yields, better marketability, better profitability, you're able to meet reality as it exists without any judgment and say, here, let's just let the market compete. So, yeah, I mean, what's your, I guess, application rates and exact costs are not necessarily necessary for here, but I think that's really important to emphasize that you're just, you are meeting the market and reality where it exists now. And giving people an opportunity to do side-by-side trials. And I mean, I got a chance to meet Jackie. I know Nigel flew me to England so I could spend half a day with Jackie McGlade. I mean, she is completely brilliant, and what she's doing with all the satellite stuff, look, like you said, I think you explained it, but I mean, like, there's all these metadata sets that the governments have captured and various satellites have captured over decades. They're integrated into one algorithm, and you can very simply, get a real-time assessment on a 10-meter square, like, pixel size of all these dynamics. That provides the ability to assess and discern and monitor in such a powerful, proactive fashion, and then to be able to go and look at landscapes on scale and identify what their needs are and begin to consider systemically, regenerating ecosystems systemically. It's just so brilliant. I don't know. I've never met people who are doing this, so I just continue just to emphasize. Is there anything else you want to say about Jackie or that downforce thing? I mean, there's so much time and energy and money spent out there trying to measure carbon, and people, all these techniques and technologies. This one just seems like it's like, fit for purpose.
I think I touched on the point, and it is fit for purpose, and the fact that we can regularly monitor the change is what's super valuable as well. So one, it was finding a technology that does this, and I think Jackie's got some big announcements coming. But being able to do this regularly, to the point where Jackie was one day telling King that he'd done something different between two of our paddocks. What's different between this paddock and that paddock, and because we can, get this done very regularly. So we were wanting to monitor the crops, and Kym saying, no, there's nothing different there, Jackie, and she said, well, I think you should have a good look at it because I think there is something different. And so Kym went back to our farm manager and said, well, can you just have a look at the farm records? Was there any different in the application rates or something different between the way you did those two paddocks? And it turned out that, there was a different number of foliar sprays on each of those two paddocks because we'd had a flood and it had got too wet to get the foliar spray on a second time. So it was starting to give us this insight that it's not just about measuring the soil carbon or the environmental biomass, it's actually becoming a farm indicator tool for us as well. So it's pretty handy when a technology can cross so many bounds. The other thing, Dan, there is that, which you and I have chatted about, is as we get to get more cost effective in an understanding of nutrient levels in food, we're really interested in that correlation between what downforce is seeing in the soil health, the soil carbon, and the end product in the food health. So if we can ideally end up with just having 2 or 3 things to measure that is going to tell us that everything is on track for the healthy food, healthy environment outcome, that will be really important, because there's a lot of people asking farmers to measure lots of things which are expensive, and we can't afford to do a lot of the measurements at the moment.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm here in South America, and I'm going to be at the COP30, gathering in a couple of days and speaking there, and it's just remarkable how far behind that community is in relation to this conversation. you know, they really, you know, are having a hard time comprehending this agriculture can be systemically beneficial. They haven't tracked the water cycle and global cooling through forests and everything else. But, you know, I'm going to be speaking to a bunch of big corporates in a couple days. And it's like, it's a dangerous dance, you know, walking in there and saying, look, we've got the answers, like, that are just like a few orders of magnitude more sophisticated than anything you're comprehending. You don't want to come across like you're arrogant and you know, cocky and whatever, but like what you guys are doing is so sophisticated, and I mean at this global scale really has powerful impact. And I think one of the points you made was about education. You know, I think we said proof at scale, then education, then enablement. Would you talk for a minute, Nigel, about, you know, what you were saying about the bringing the rain back? I mean, one of the speakers we had initially had lined up to speak was Anastasia Markievna from Russia, who's been doing a lot of work with she calls it the biotic pump. We weren't able to get her to come on our schedules couldn't work, but what you're doing in WA, what you're proposing to do in WA, I think, and what you have been doing in other parts of the world with bringing trees back on scale and having that functionally bring the rain back, it bears repeating over and over again for anybody who hasn't heard about it. It's so the implications are just so epic.
So I'd say we're not the expert scientists in this space, Dan, but we talk to the expert scientists and we're trying to read as many papers as possible. But the broad statistic that we understand from the Australian analysis is 1,400 square kilometres. Plantings is the scale that will confidently return rainfall or affect the water vapor to be released in that atmosphere. And I think probably the background to that is, you know, I think we all look at the soil carbon in the atmosphere. The water vapor graphs is not dissimilar, and so as the vapor's building up in the water, it's in the atmosphere, it's a warming issue for the climate, a big one. So getting these large belts back where vapor can be released in the form of rainfall, one, it's obviously critical for farming ongoing, but it's also critical from the climate perspective as well. So we're really in the early stages. As I say, we've planted 30 million trees in a single belt at the moment, and they're all growing very, very well. So we're relying on science to give us the evidence to do the plantings we're doing, and we're hoping that the results come our way. But yes, we've got an even larger project in the planning at the moment, and excited to be working down that space and finding the outcome.
Anything you want to say about that, Kym? Or take a pass?
No, it's just exciting. Look, it's a really, I mean, having kind of got involved in regenerative agriculture space, I think 25 years ago, it's certainly an exciting time. It's an exciting space to be working right here and now, and seeing this starting to happen on a more of a broad scale, global scale. And I'd also say with sometimes there can be a little bit of carbon tunnel vision, but as we know, there's so many interrelated and interconnected benefits to building carbon in soils or carbon in general. You've got, health, education, you've got biodiversity, air pollution. There's all of these things are interrelated and interconnected. And I think, managing landscapes in such a way that, farms can look more like ecologies, and we can have our cake and eat it as well. And actually the problem is the solution, and agriculture is very much part of the solution if we go about agriculture in a way that is a direct benefit to the broader ecology, which I firmly believe that it can be.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, I do a decent amount of traveling these days, and I mean, have done over time, and maybe not everyone has been around the world and seen different bioregions, but there are large parts of this planet which are quite dry, which don't have a lot of plants on them, which don't have a lot of animals on them. Australia sort of is famous for being a big desert. People don't quite know exactly what Australia is, but it's a lot of it's dry, right? But I mean, what you're talking about here is, and there's others I've met down there that are doing it as well. You know, if we are systemic and thoughtful and proactive and operate at, ecosystem scale, we have the capacity with our technology, with our science, to relatively quite inexpensively systemically heal ecosystems, which will have, among other concomitant benefits, the functional, re, um, rain coming back. I mean, there's so many documented dynamics where this is occurring. The fact is, when plants transpire through water vapor, you get enough of that in there, enough nucleating structures that turns into water, turns into clouds, which turned into rain. And this is why the concerns about the Amazon being cut down to grow corn and soy, and they're like, that's causing the rain to go away when the trees aren't there anymore. They aren't transpiring and they're not making rain. And it's turning into it's desertifying. So yeah, the implications are just massive, and the fact that you're actually working on it systemically, so exciting.
And it wasn't always like that, Dan. Harry was reminding me of a story again the other day, that in the 1800s, some of the early white settlers into Australia were doing paintings in the southern states of Victoria of the landscape, and there happened to be a scientist with them at the time, and they took core samples and sent them back to England and actually measured the level of soil organic matter in those soils. And this is from late 1800s, something around that. The average soil organic matter level in those soils, out of all of the samples that they took, was 22%.
Yeah.
You'd be hard pressed to, that was the average. So you'd be hard pressed to find in a lot of those soils today, soil organic matters above 1%. So, can we have a positive impact upon the landscape? And actually, it's shown us what the potential is, because if you've been healthy yourself, it's possible to get healthy again. So that sort of thing is a really good reminder, gives you the strength to carry on, because we know it's possible that we can actually restore these landscapes back to what.
And that wasn't it wasn't just happenstance, right? My understanding, it was a critical, it was a result of intelligent, proactive, multi-generational, thoughtful action
Management.
Relationship with land by the indigenous people is what caused that, high level of system function. Similar in North America, when the white man first came, they're like, wow, this place is amazing. What a Garden of Eden. Who are these primitive little, people walking around? Like, no, those are very sophisticated. It's very sophisticated individuals engaging in a very comprehensive set of dynamics, which you have no idea about. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, I think we have the model from our indigenous forebears of how we can have positive impact on the planet, at ecosystem scale. It's just a question of owning that. Yeah. Let me see. Let me see what else I'd like to talk about here. I just maybe the balance of the biodiversity that you're envisioning. I mean, Nigel, I think you talked about it, like there are certain pieces of the landscape that are maybe more appropriate for agriculture and certain pieces that are not. And the way you're looking at the landscapes and looking and say, okay, here's appropriate for farms, here's appropriate for forests. And you're not just putting in those monoculture forests, you're putting in much more diverse plantings of indigenous species of plants and working to bring the fauna back. Do you want just any other bits about this? This is not like pine tree plantations that you're doing, right? I mean, I've been again a lot of the world, and like we're reforesting, we're putting in lots of loblolly pines. Like there's no diversity of life in that ecosystem. Yeah.
No, really good point to discuss, Dan. So backing back a little bit, looking at the 30-20-30 concept, 30% of the say Australia to be with biodiverse by 2030. At the moment, I think in the last 20 years, it's moved from about 16% to 23.5% in Australia. So there has been more and more land getting set up for that. The way we're looking at then is say, can we look at individual farms that we're working on, and what percentage can we restore to biodiversity without impacting food production, as I emphasised before, and then looking at the larger landscape piece. Just one point on the types of planting. So with the 30 million planting, I think that's biodiverse planting. Probably, in time we'll get more species, but that's between 8 and 12 species spread across there, which is from the tree species, and then we've got obviously shrubs and plants and grasses and things that propagate naturally as the mycorrhizal fungi return. But we are doing one farm at the moment that is we're doing 28% back to planting, and of that 28%, about 75% of that is actually a forestry project. So we've still got native forestry clearing happening here in Australia, disappointingly, and even if it's even if legislation did change one day that could be ceased, Australia is then importing timber from native forests. So we have got a plan inside Tiverton that part of the work that we need to do is to be growing timber for the future as well. And detailed biodiverse plantings and timber production, forestry production is a real challenge. So that's probably a new frontier we're in, is like, how many species can we do, and what's the life of that forest for harvesting, and what's it going to look like post harvest from a soil perspective, and perhaps a shrub and grasses perspective, and then would we grow timber on it again a second time, after the 25 years? So there's a bit more thinking that needs to go into there. So we don't want to say we're just doing biodiverse plantings. We're doing the majority of that, but we have to be very cognizant of the future requirements.
Yeah. There's a couple of things that are coming to mind. One is, we had the Haggertys on a couple of weeks ago, Ian and Di Haggerty from WA.
Yeah.
And one of their slides was a picture of the clouds from the aligning with the rabbit-proof fence.
Yes.
And here was the wheat belt, and here was the area where the old growth forest had not been clear cut yet. And it was like, there's the clouds over the forests, and here's the no clouds over the wheat belt. It was yeah. Anyway, I know you've been doing work in Africa. A lot of attendees on this call are from Africa. Is there anything you can say about that, or the various countries you're working in, and the opportunities and potential overlaps or ways this can be brought there?
Yeah, we've spent a bit of time in Kenya of late. Jackie works out of Nairobi University, and we're just going down the pathway now with two local partners, local farm producers, with our Circle Ag, so that we're sort of writing a farm transformation plan with them. So we're hoping within the next 12 months that we'll actually be operating in partnership with two farmers in Kenya to build a Circle Ag manufacturing facility, and then to supply lots of local farmers with that, and work with Downforce on the measurement piece as well. So yeah, it's probably our first foray beyond Australia's shores in Kenya, and hopefully we'll have some significant announcements there in about 6 months. Probably not much more I can say at the moment, but we do want to work in the both north and south of Nairobi.
Well, I will be in Kenya next week, and maybe there's some connections we can make there. Definitely, we've got a bunch of people who are very interested in this work in Kenya, and good connections to the politics and things like that. When you say a Circle Ag plant, I think you showed me the specs one time. It's a bunch of tanks and some pipes, right? You're basically doing a bunch of fermentation in a controlled environment. And what you're talking about is, X number of millions of dollars to build a facility that's X number of percents of an acre or whatever. Once that's been built, you have the ability then to rapidly produce integrated products that can be used on scale at a low price in bioregions where this stuff is not available. And that's just, for anybody who's listening to this now or listening to this recording later, I hope they can understand the implications of that, and feel free to reach out to you guys, because I mean, this is what we need. We need alternate, dynamics to the dominant agricultural paradigm, and it's got to be competitive, price competitive.
In that transformation equation I was talking about, this is the enablement piece, really, because and look, I think, from all of the work that we've been doing, we're incredibly optimistic. We can actually see a transformational future in agriculture now because of the results that are coming, and this key piece of being able to provide product that's really really good value, good, cost effective and competitive, makes a big difference. Because I guess we've been living, in this place when we're doing some organics and we're doing regenerative products in the early days, and we're all sort of thinking, how do we get a bit more for our price because we've got healthier food, and I think under this model, the model that we're working towards is like, well, let's really lower the cost base where we can of farming and be producing the best food, and it will sell first. We don't necessarily need the highest price this way. Interestingly, and you've taught me a lot about this, Dan, with this, the nutrient measurement piece, but Kym touched on our olive oil. Our olive oil, which is six-year-old olive trees, the Coratina is going straight into the premium brand. That premium brand actually sells at about 40% premium price. So maybe along the line, we're going to strike it lucky until everybody's farming this way, and then we would expect every price to sit to be the market. But if the ultimate goal was that we want to stop food inflation as well and produce really high quality food, then this is a really good way to go if we can manage our costs. And Kym was touching on the fact that we need to use a lot less of the bad and hopefully none of the bad in time. But that's another cost base for a farmer at the moment in production. So if we can be tackling every line in the cost side, then ideally we can get away around these concerns of what people are talking about, droughtflation and floodflation now, from impacts.
I call it the octuple bottom line, not because there's specifically 8 pieces to it, but just because there's so many solutions that occur through doing one thing, which is working with nature well. And yeah, it's just brilliant. Well, I mean, I've used up my half hour. I'm going to start going to the questions in the Q&A box, and we'll see where the conversation proceeds from there. Donald says, is there a New Zealand equivalent of this type of work? Are you guys familiar with anybody in New Zealand doing anything along these lines?
No, we've been chatting to a couple of New Zealanders though, and I think it's going to be something we will do in New Zealand in the not too distant future. Yeah,
I'll say, Donald, I don't know anybody around the world who's doing this. These guys are in Australia, where a lot of innovation comes from. A disproportionate amount of agricultural innovation seems to come from Australia, and then it gets spread about and around the rest of the world. But any names you're going to share there with anybody or not? It's all private right now. You'll work it out. How about New Zealand? No.
Oh, nothing. No,
nothing.
Yeah, no. Sorry.
No, that's fine. No, you're running a business. Okay. Priscilla Tux said that the CEC is very important. Obviously. Do you want to talk about the Albrecht mineral balancing ratios and things like that, Kym? That's a piece that I've gone back and forth with various people about, like, you do or you don't. It's really nice, but you can cheat it. It's really about what the plant's getting. If you got 25% calcium level on a 30 CEC soil, you're never going to get that calcium level up on raising wheat. So you have to do other strategies. Do you want to just go into that for a couple minutes?
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the key things that I look at when I look at a soil test, is the calcium magnesium ratio, because that'll tell me whether the soil's breathing or not, and my little workforce in there, whether they're suffocating or if they're thriving. So more often than not, particularly in the southern states of Australia, we're working on soils that have very high magnesium, sometimes very high sodium. So your sodium ends up being over potassium, which kind of tends to limit the uptake of it. But again, back to the humic acid and buffering and kind of mitigating the negatives of those things to enhance and extract the inherent fertility that we see in the soil when we look at the total test. I'm not real big fan. You can kind of send a lot of farmers go broke trying to get the perfect 68-12 calcium magnesium ratio. You know, amendment. We're much more in favour of very targeted, you know, ultrafine micronized powders that address the immediate root zone and that area right around the seed. So in our dryland cropping operations, we'll use, you know, a few litres of a very micronized liquid lime where we have that imbalance within the profile. I never put lime out to balance the pH. That sorts itself out over time. But as far as the seed's concerned, it doesn't know the broader environment. It thinks it's living in utopia. So if we can create that ideal environment directly, and it's all around efficiency, the same as, you know, the use of the bioferts and all of these different strategies that we're using. We're working with a lot of farmers that are still using synthetic fertilizer, but we're trying to get the maximum fertilizer use efficiency out of every single input that is being used. And then through that process, having healthier plants allows us to drop out a lot of those harmful chemicals and the like. So yeah, I definitely acknowledge it. CECs, low CEC soil needs regular feeding. They're like a child with a small stomach. You don't want to feed them up with 3 months worth of pasta on the first day. Larger, heavier CEC soil is, you know, that can take a little bit of soil amendment if it's deemed necessary and appropriate. So horses for courses, depending. You got to see whether it's a Lamborghini with a handbrake on or a Volkswagen without any wheels, to see what you're driving first, and then you can use the appropriate strategies.
Are you using some dry minerals at all in this protocol, or not at all?
Yeah, we do use some dry minerals, particularly probably phosphorus. We use some soil amendment phosphorus in some situations, organic forms of phosphorus, whether that's soft rock phosphate or guano. I find that to be quite a useful strategy where there's a little bit of acidity in the soil, and the immediate sort of, you know, conventional agronomic approach would be to use lime and then use acidifying synthetic phosphorus inputs. But actually find it really beneficial to use organic phosphorus and utilize some of the acidity that's present in the soil to break that bond between calcium and phosphorus to liberate both minerals, and find that as an effective strategy. With dry mineral phosphorus application.
Phosphorus only, nothing else, no calcium, no other trace elements.
Yeah, sometimes we will do a little bit of lime or gypsum. We tend not to have many circumstances where we need magnesium magnesite or magnesium oxide or dolomite. But again, I'm much more in favour, particularly on these real broad scale, sort of 3,000-4,000 hectare farms, rather than a broad scale, broadcast ag lime application. We use micronized calcium carbonate in liquid form directly down the tube, as I said, just to trick the plant into thinking the whole hectare is ideal, but really it's just around the root zone and that early root development, growth and microbial association that you're helping to facilitate by targeting just that specific zone. And in terms of traces and alike, all of our traces really go through the biofertilizer process. So we're fast tracking the availability of the mineral by putting it through the biofert process. And then, you know, as we spoke about before, we can tweak it according to what soil tests or leaf tissue sap tests are showing us, where we may need, you know, form of chelated zinc or manganese or copper. And again, it's not in an order to really fertilize the crop, it's to try to enhance the crop's ability to be able to communicate with the microbiome and access the banking minerals. At the end of the day, we want the plant to do the work, and the way to a healthy soil is through a healthy plant.
Yep. No, it's just, I mean, it's one of those perennial questions in the broader community about remineralizing or not. Can microbes find everything that they need? Or, you know, I mean, your classic Australian soils are very, very ancient and weathered and worn and don't have a lot of, you know, minerals, or they're tied up. Some people say that's no problem. You stimulate the biology, everything will happen. I'm just looking forward to having a big open data set. Hopefully, as part of the process of defining nutrient density, we can begin to collect all this metadata and we can actually see. Like, I just don't know. Talk to somebody like,
I think
what's the answer? How do we know what the answer is? Yeah,
I think you make a really good point there, Dan. It reminded me, I did have a note there before, that Australia is a very ancient landscape. We have extremely weathered soils, and so much of the fertility has actually gone out of our landscape, particularly with the last 40 or 50 years of agricultural practice. And I'm of the belief that just adding microbes is not enough. Again, back to that analogy of 3 legs of the stool, we've got organic matter, microbes, and minerals. All 3 of them are equally as important as each other. And I think too much focus on one leg of the stool more than the other leads to an imbalanced stool. I really think that the mineral part, that bioavailability, is absolutely critical, because that mineral availability drives microbial function as well as plant performance. And microbes have their role in inoculation and things like that, can be useful strategies, but ultimately you need that mineral component has to be there. I mean, 95% of your crop weight comes for free, but that through carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but that whole process won't work effectively if you don't have that 5% mineral availability. So if we can ensure that that crop is nutritionally satisfied, if you like, and it can optimize its performance, well, then the microbes are there unless you've metal bromided your soil. We can bring back life into the soil through a healthy plant, is my belief.
Yeah. All right. Donald asks again, so downforce can be quickly upskilled / understood via AI?
No, it's AI is a key part of it all.
And it can be quickly upskilled to anywhere on the planet.
Oh, it's working right across the planet now. Yeah, it's built for the whole planet. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Jackie, I think you mentioned it in very much passing. She worked for the European Space Agency for a long time. I think she did a bunch of stuff with the UN, but she's well connected to a lot of the satellites that are up in space and have been there for a long time, and the different frequencies that they're operating from, and the things that they can perceive. Right. So
Jackie's unique, a mathematician who worked a long time in the European Space Agency as a senior researcher for the United Nations, being the chief scientist of the European Union. I think at some point, she's overqualified to invent something like this, but she's invented something that's just absolutely brilliant. But it was designed from day one based on the entire globe, because all of the geomorphology, all of the soil function, and it is massive similarities, just different times and where it's been worn and different histories. But putting all that data together and then using her satellite expertise has been it. So no, the downforce pretty much are focusing on 3 main continents at the moment, but it's built for the globe.
And what are those 3 main continents?
Europe, Australia, and US.
And North America. Yeah.
North America. Yeah.
People found them. I've heard, this is the second person I've said recently. They call the US North America. I'm like, no. North America, the US. Like, no. There's other countries here too. There too. All right. Again, there's a long one here, but I think it's probably worth reading from an anonymous attendee. Just next level brilliance here from all 3 of you, tirelessly using science and other actually logical means to partner with nature in her eternal principles. Thank you for all you are doing, each of you truly generative men working in harmony with our Mother Earth. I sincerely wonder if, in light of what you are showing here, we can agree to say there is really no climate emergency at all. Is it not more accurate to say that there is an extremely dire emergency on Earth related to disastrous industrial ag practices that are destroying the planet more and more rapidly? Certainly it's up to us to determine the true alternatives, as you all do so amazingly well, so totally convincingly for those of us still with eyes to see and ears to hear. That said, do we really want / need to partner with the organizations that are attempting to enlist people into a climate crisis narrative that is a lie, essentially? Obviously, this is a meta kind of question, but seriously, I want to ask it. It's a big one, right?
Well, I think what our focus is health as a whole, and I think, there's all sorts of issues that are happening. So if we want to turn back the clock and deal with degradation, whether it's change to climate, change to soil health, loss of biodiversity, extinction of our animals, we live in a holistic world, and what we're trying to work here is a holistic solution, or build for an outcome so that we've all got, a healthy planet, and we're all and healthy human population that can survive on this planet. So I think, we look at it from that perspective. We're not really engaging in the politics of any piece. It's really, we want to all be healthy, and we want to have a healthy future for the future generations.
Kym, what do you think? Any comments?
Yeah, reminds me of one of my early mentors said all the problems of the world can be solved in a garden. All your transportation problems, all your pollution problems, all your waste problems, all your human health problems and the like. And I guess we're trying to, farm on a larger scale, garden on a larger scale, if you can farm like a gardener and garden like a farmer. And I look at Australia and who manages ecosystems and landscapes. 70% of the continent is managed by farmers. So I think that's a really good place to start. And all of the work that Nigel's doing with biodiversity and tree plantings and ecological restoration and biodiversity fits beautifully into that, so that we, get to a space, back to that 22% organic matter in southern states of Victoria, where the farm was a managed ecology. I think the potential's there, and we have the technology, so to speak, and we just head down every day and getting on with the job, and working with people who are excited to be part of the solution.
Yeah, I'm here in Bogota in Colombia right now, and there's some people up in the mountains called the Kogi, who have been relatively colonized. And I know a number of people who have gone and visited them. I'm not going to be able to this trip, but somebody I was just talking to said he had gone. No, was it Patrick in our previous presentation? And asked them what it was. He said he asked them where have we gone wrong, and their answer was, you forgot that consciousness is in all things. That we forgot that the tree and the stone and the water and everything else is alive. And yeah, I mean, I look at agriculture. I don't think we can just blame chemical agriculture since World War II. I think desertification has been going on for a lot longer than that, since we've been engaging in the destructive relationships with nature. But to answer the question simply, I certainly don't use the narrative of a climate crisis. I focus on the opportunities to heal the earth. And it seems to me that the facts, the science, the stories, the experience, the examples of this being done everywhere around the planet by people on all kinds of scales, in partnership with all kinds of animals and plants and microbes, is overwhelming if you're willing to look. So yeah, I think it's a fair narrative that yeah. But if there's money to be made, right? If one co-benefit of improving, farm viability is carbon sequestration, and you can get paid for that, and farmers get paid, make decisions based on economics, then we can use the fact that carbon is a market to, increase the advantage of engaging these practices.
Another way of looking at this, Dan, is there's a finite amount of carbon in the world, and we're better off with it in our soils, because we can produce a lot more healthy food and have healthy biodiversity. So the rebalancing or reNaturing of carbon and water is a really important part of the future.
Yeah, I think in the vast majority of the carbon that's, if you look at the air, the soil, and the water, the vast majority is in the oceans, right? I mean, if you look at the and whatever's in the atmosphere mostly goes into the oceans. And if it starts to come out of the atmosphere, it comes out of the ocean to rebalance the atmosphere. And so there's this massive sink there, which could be used, but maybe that's a whole nother topic for a different day. Jennifer asked, the Russian scientists you weren't able to bring to the conference, name, and is it likely I can find more about her work online? Her name is Anastasia Makarievna. I think it's Makarievna, Makarievna. And the term you want to look up associated with her is biotic pump. She's got a Substack. She's got a few podcast recording stuff out there. She's absolutely brilliant. Hard physicist, scientist. Anastasia Makarievna. Yeah, hope to have her on next year. We had Walter Yenna, who's also an Australian, on a couple of years ago talking about all these things. There's just a bunch of people out there working on this. Okay, Jane asks, what/who on the follow-up tending, i.e. after initial establishment of a 30 million tree or even 1 million tree planting biodiverse corridor until the rain does come back? How is that land managed post-planting? I think is basically your question. What's your process? How have you been doing it?
Sorry, I don't understand the question, Dan.
Who's doing the follow-up tending and what follow-up tending is happening between when the plantings are put back in a desertified area and when the ecosystems begin to heal?
So that can be a number of different ways. I mean, we take responsibility for the feral management as well. There's a variety of projects we've got happening that we're transferring ownership to communities that want them as well. And some of the partnership projects where we'll be doing significant plantings on a farm. We've got First Nations groups that are getting land ownership through that process as well. So it can happen. It's sort of horses for courses, really, depending on where the project is and the work that we're doing. Where it's a large scale project for carbon, where we've sold for carbon income, obviously that has to be managed in perpetuity under that carbon agreement. So the company does that too.
Let me see. Priscilla says, you talked of a 30-day anaerobic composting period. Are you also doing any aerobic composting, and to what extent? I think she's presuming that you're talking about not a liquid ferment, but a compost pile.
Yeah, so ours is a liquid fermentation, so it's an anaerobic liquid fermentation process, similar to making beer or wine. It's a fermentation vat. So it's very, very similar actually to making wine. You can't quite drink it, but it's a very similar process.
Cool. Yeah, but it's a liquid, not dry. It's not a pile of
It's
stuff
a liquid
on the ground. It's in a tank. Yeah,
it's
kind of
in
like
a tank,
like a
liquid,
wheat tea kind of a thing or something along those lines.
Yeah, that's right. And it's anaerobic for a reason. It creates a controlled environment and the pH drops within a very short period of time. So the final product ends up being of a pH around 3.6 to 4, something within that range, which makes it A, extremely stable, and B, void of any pathogens. We get pathogen testing done on every single cycle we make. And the pH is a big part of that. Why there's no pathogens, because they don't like to exist in those sort of pH environments. And it also means that on-farm storage is able to occur over a very extended period of time. So, again, using cropping as an example, a farmer may use 30 litres a hectare down the tube at sowing, and that we would fill their tanks for them to do that purpose, and then we'd refill their tanks for them to be able to do their foliar applications during the year at, say, 10 litres or 15 litres a hectare, and maybe run over their country twice. So once at sowing and then 2 foliars. So just a one refill of their tank, because they can store it for an extended period of time because of that low pH.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think when we talked to the Haggertys, they were talking about something which is not too far off that as far as what their scale and quantity of materials. It was a primarily microbial ferment that they were using on their extremely denuded lands in Western Australia, and seeing profound improvements. So definitely seems common alignment here. Megan asks, what would be your recommendations for someone searching for a property to begin regenerative agriculture on? Other specific site considerations?
Want to go, Nigel?
Well, just go where there's some rainfall. Really, I think we're probably trying to prove the regenerative agriculture approach across all different landscape types and all different food production types. And when you get into it as well, the land prices that vary depending on the conventional or traditional productivity of the land impacts it as well. So I guess the technical answer is look for the value discrepancy in the area that you'd like to find it. But we're pretty confident that the process works on lighter country and heavy country.
That was my solution. Find a cheap place that's looks like in rough shape. And doesn't cost much because working with nature, you can rebuild anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't spend money you don't need to spend.
But buy the worst house in the best street.
First house in the best street. That's exactly what my place was. Yeah. Mark, absolutely brilliant work and framework for biological regeneration. Does proof of scale go in both directions? Because in order to get short supply chains and include the metabolic and neurological health of people, biological corridors could connect to smaller scale human habitats. Yes. Any comments? I mean, we want people back on the land, I think, that's my philosophy, is we shouldn't be in these megalopolises. No comments.
People per acre, as you say. And absolutely, I think any natural patterning in all of the things that we're talking about can happen on any scale, and that's the beauty of it. Obviously, we need to make it happen on a very large scale to have the impact, but there's also great benefit in having, it's death by 1,000 cuts, so the solution is 1,000 band-aids. So it can absolutely happen on a small scale, and that connectivity that Nigel is speaking to, as well as connectivity between big jigsaw pieces. So it's a big jigsaw, and I think joining all the dots, and also that means that everyone can be involved as well, which is absolutely critical. Not just big scale, but also small scale. And I think that empowerment is absolutely essential for all of us to move forward.
His second question was, with all the tree planting, have you considered biochar with its many functions?
Absolutely. Biochar comes, so a lot of it comes back to cost, and we don't necessarily need biochar unless, I guess the super sandy soil might need that type of kick along. In some cases, we're looking at using algae from wastewater, municipal wastewater treatment, as opposed to biochar, because we could just dry that and put that straight in the ground. So again, it comes back to the cost effectiveness of the solution. There's no doubt the biochar is very successful. So if you can access that very cheaply, it's a great way to kick along the soil. Do you want to add something to that, Kym?
Yeah, I'd say that biochar with the addition of biology is very powerful, because biochar without biology is char. And I've used biochar together with the biofertilizer, and the biochar being a housing for microorganisms works really, really effectively in combination, as Nigel said, where it's appropriate and cost effective and required, then absolutely. All of the cards are on the table. And it's just choosing the right tool to meet the criteria of the project, both from a soil ecology agronomic perspective, as well as the context of the landowner, as well as the economics. So yeah, biochar has its place 100%.
Great. All right, we're just about at the end of our 2 hours. I've got like 2 minutes left. Any final comments or words of wisdom or inspirations either of you would like to leave us with?
Well, just on that scale question, it's interesting as well. The reason that we're working and trying to work with farms of very significant scale is that if we're going to transition the industry, it's the large farmers that we need to convince of the change. There's lots of Kyms and Nigels and Dans around, and until we get the profitability piece really confidently across to the large farmers, once that happens, I think a lot of those people will influence the change of everyone in their community. So, but we are working with small farmers, and we don't want that to be overlooked. The Farm My School group, for example, that's. We're going to work with lots of schools, and they're farming 1 or 2 acres at a time. So definitely, change can only come if we can look right across the community and the education piece as well. So I think there was a guy I used to read a bit about. He's sort of talking about change. Change is really, really, really hard at the start, and really messy in the middle, and glorious in the end. And that's we're sort of working through the messy in the middle piece at the moment to get to this profitability piece. But I guess we're feeling really confident that this transformation can take place because we can deal with it at the financial level and prove the financial outcome.
Yeah, beautiful. Kym?
Don't have anything really to add to that other than to thank you very much, Dan, for what you're doing and the opportunity to speak with everyone here. And we keeping onwards and upwards and really focused on addressing root causes with practical solutions. And it's an exciting time to be involved in this space, having national and global impact. So thanks again for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dan, and for having us and for everyone being here today to hear the story.
Thank you both very much, and for getting up so early and for sharing your brilliant work. One more in a long list of brilliant Australians who are just showing us, the rest of us, how to do things. Yeah, I'm just so impressed with everything you're doing. So thank you.